Hey founders, in this session, we're going to talk about how to evaluate your startup. Evaluating and getting to know your startup is super important at any stage of the life cycle of your company. If you're pre-launch, it's super important that you evaluate your startup to see if your idea is actually a good business idea. If you're post-launch, it is critical that you evaluate your startup, particularly if you're encountering problems like, why is my startup not growing? Or how can I improve customer acquisition? Or why is my startup not resonating with investors? So always evaluate your startup, and we're going to talk about that next.
How can you predict if an investor will like your startup? But before we get started, let me just say, we don't just work with companies looking to fundraise or to be venture backed. In fact, we're just as happy, if not more excited, to work with bootstrap companies and companies that are looking to grow through revenue. Having said that, most of you are looking to fundraise, so let's go ahead and define startups the way investors do. If you're looking to raise capital and will be talking to investors, it's very important for you to know that not all startups are equal in the eyes of the investor. The definition of a startup for investors is a company that's designed to grow exponentially and very, very quickly. So if you're not looking to build a company that grows very, very fast, then you're building a small business. And that's okay. There's absolutely nothing wrong with being a small business. In fact, half of the total workforce in the United States is employed by small businesses. They're crucial to our economy. Just know that investors are interested in high growth companies, the so-called unicorns or billion-dollar companies. They're looking to invest in the companies that can provide exponential returns and not small businesses. In the notes following this video, you'll find a link to a blog post where we go a little bit more into detail in understanding the difference between a high growth company and a small business. But in short, if you're looking for funding, the evidence that investors will want to see is evidence that show that you can grow quickly and exponentially. One more thing you need to know before we get started is that Chris, Gabby, and I catch a lot of criticism because we don't tell founders if and when their baby's ugly. And it's true. Chris, Gabby, and I will never tell you if your startup or your idea is bad. And there's a reason for that. It's not just to be nice to you or because we want to avoid having uncomfortable conversations with you. We just happen to see our job at Stitch Crew as someone who's there not to figure out what is wrong with your company, but somebody that's there to help you figure out all the different ways in which your startup could potentially win. Because if you look at the companies that weren't necessarily supposed to win, the Googles, the Airbnbs, and the Netflix, they weren't so obvious at the beginning, were they? So who are we to tell you that your idea can't work or won't work? Plus, we also know that throughout the life cycle of your company, you'll come across enough people that will try to poke holes at your startup and point out all the different ways why your company won't work. But we happen to know that if the problem and the willingness to solve the problem is there, we can find multiple ways to make it work. Ultimately, what you just need to know is that we will challenge you to think about your business model, market, and approach. But instead of just pointing out all the things that are wrong with your startup, our job is to be open and creative enough to problem solve with you and to help you think of all the possible ways your company can win. In order to do this, though, we want you to think of your startup as a hypothesis, and your job is to construct the thesis. One very important rule, though, is you need to keep it simple, because one of the most common mistakes we see first-time founders make often is that they overthink their startup. Your job is to keep it simple, concise, and consistent. To do this, we're going to break this down into 3 different categories so we can build a hypothesis around your startup in a way that will outline all the reasons why your startup should succeed before you even launch. These will be the things that you'll need to prove to make sure that your company can actually scale. A startup idea is always composed of 3 things: the problem, which basically outlines the initial conditions as to why your startup needs to exist; Then there's the solution, which is basically the theory and hypothesis that you're proposing. And finally, why you? Here you need to prove that your solution is better than anything else that's already out there in the market. So let's discuss the ways in which you can assess the problem you're set out to solve. Is the problem that you're solving affecting a large number of people or organizations? Because to build a company that can scale exponentially, you'll want to avoid problems that only affect a small number of people or a small number of organizations. Is a problem a growing problem? Is there an urgency to solving the problem? These type of problems need to be solved quickly in order to avoid chaos. For example, think of all the startups and companies that have emerged as a result of COVID. Is a problem mandatory? Meaning there's no other way around the problem. People must solve the problem in order to function or operate. Again, think of all the problems people, retail, and restaurant business owners encountered as a result of the pandemic shutdown. Is a problem expensive to solve? We like problems that are expensive to solve because if you can solve it, and you're one of the few that can, you can actually charge a lot of money for it. And finally, is the problem frequent? Meaning it happens over and over again. This last one about frequency is super important because the more frequent the problem, the more opportunities you'll have to convert early adopters into using your product or service. Because if you want to change behavior, you usually need 3 things in place. You'll need the motivation to change, you need to provide the ability to change, and you need a trigger to get people into action. And if the customer is experiencing the pain point often enough, it'll likely motivate them to take action and try new things, like your startup. Whatever the problem you're solving, you want to make sure that it checks at least one of these categories, preferably 2 or more. You don't have to check all of them, but ideally, your problem will check 2 or more of these boxes. All right, so what about the solution? The only thing we have to say about the solution is that you don't want to start here. You always want to start by understanding the problem you're setting out to solve. Often what happens is, particularly to first-time founders or tech enthusiasts, is that they get excited. They get excited about the latest tech and they just want to build a company around it. So they start with the solution and then they say, okay, what kind of problem can I solve with this tech? And look, we're not saying that it's impossible to build a company this way, but it is certainly the most inefficient way to do it. We will always suggest that founders start with the problem first because it's much easier to start with the problems people actually have and then figure out the best technology or service you can use to actually solve the problem. Because if you go the other way around, you're going to have to reverse engineer the problem around the technology you're excited about. And this often leads to a slower growth pattern than if you would have just started with the problem first. So look at what you're building right now. What's the reason you're building it? Is it because you only care about the technology or about being a founder? Or do you really care about solving the problem that you'll use whatever technology or means you can to actually solve it? This last one, but certainly not least, is the reason why your solution is going to work. This is where you have to address what your unfair advantage in the market truly is. Why you're going to win versus everyone else. And this piece of information is the reason why investors are going to choose you versus anyone else. So what's your unfair advantage? We believe there are 5 different categories of unfair advantages, and you need more than one to win. The first one has to do with your team. Is your team comprised of at least one founder that is so exceptional at understanding the problem or building the solution that they'd be considered an expert? Now, don't feel bad if this is not you, because 99% of startups don't fit under this category. The other unfair advantage is being in a market that's growing at least 20% year over year. Now, be careful with this one, because if this is your only unfair advantage, note that this is the weakest one. Because what happens if there's a shift in the market? Something you can't control, like COVID-19. The third unfair advantage has to do with your product or service. Is your product or service 10 times better than what's already being offered in the market? And we're not just talking about twice or 3 times better or faster. We're talking about an order of magnitude. Because 2 times or 3 times better, it's not enough for investors to think this is a slam dunk. The next one is acquisition. A lot of founders make the mistake of thinking that paid acquisition is the only way to grow a company. But let's just say this works and you actually do start getting very popular. What's going to happen is that you're actually going to attract a lot of competitors and you're going to dwindle over time. So you want to find an acquisition path that actually leads to organic growth. How can you grow this thing without having to pay for it? A $0 acquisition is definitely an unfair advantage. And the last one is building a network effect. As your networks and community grows, the value of your company grows along with it. Before we wrap up, there are 2 more things that we want to cover in this session in order to prove that you can win. The first one is we want you to ask yourself if you truly believe that you can build the product or service you want to build. This is a must. Otherwise, none of it matters, right? The second belief is, can you sell it? Assuming you actually build or have the product or service, can you actually take it to the next level and get it into market and sell it? Now, please take the next 5 or 10 minutes to think about what your unfair advantages are. Let us know in the comments section or in the next peer-to-peer meeting.